Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mad Mamluks. My name is Sim. Along with me is my co-host, Mort.
Assalamu alaikum.
Sheikh Amr is out. He, as usual, didn't realize what the day it was and what the schedule was, so I'm going to embarrass him a little bit. We have a wonderful show for you guys this afternoon, but before we get started, help us out on patreon.com/the Mad Mamluks. Alternatively, you could go to themadmamluks.com/donate and help us out that way. Our guest today is Ashraf Nubani. He is an attorney who helped defend some of the most infamous Muslims who are accused of terrorism by the U.S. government. He is also an author of Islam's Challenge for America. Please welcome Ashraf Nubani. Assalamu alaikum, Ashraf.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, Ashraf, I don't know if you know this show on Netflix called Daredevil. And it's about an attorney who's a superhero. He's blind, and he defends other fellow superheroes who are being accused by the government or anyone of terrorism. So there's a familiarity. His name is Matt Murdock. He plays a character called Daredevil on it, and
he does a lot of pro bono work.
And a lot of pro bono work because he, as the audience will come to find out, struggles with finances as you did in your efforts to help many of the fellow Muslims in your community. It is an honor for you to join the show. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me. And when did this show come on? Because this is the first time, by the way, I'm hearing about it.
Oh, really?
Maybe they took it off. I should be suing someone for some copyrights, huh?
Yeah, no. Daredevil's been a character of Marvel Comics for decades, but the show got really popular almost 4 or 5 years ago. I think I would say about 5 years ago, when Netflix aired about 3 seasons of his comic book adaptation to the film, or the film adaptation. But yeah, it was a hit, and everyone loved that character. And you have that same demeanor as he does. But tell us, just let's let the audience know a little bit about you, because I know many people aren't aware of a lot of the work that you've done, because it's a situation that many Muslims don't want to at least publicly support, because they don't want to be thought of as someone who sympathizes with their terrorists. So maybe just start off with that. How did you get into the scene, and how and what were some of the challenges in representing some of these people?
Right. Well, I guess it started with I would say going back to high schools, when I decided that I wanted to be, I think, an attorney, and my educational career took a different turn, but then I ended up going to law school eventually. So basically, it was 9/11. You know how Shakespeare says some people are born great, others achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. So I don't consider myself, of course, great, but the idea was that, the times brought about a situation where I felt that, I needed to do something that was worthwhile, that was based on integrity and morality, something that, I think in society is really missing. And so when 9/11, I had represented other people before 9/11 actually, and similar cases, and one of them was the case of Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk, who was the head of the political bureau of Hamas at the time. This was in the mid-90s, and I worked with the attorney at the time. I was still just had graduated from law school, and so I had a history. And before that, before the case of Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk, I interned for the attorney in New York, famous attorney. I don't know if people still remember his name. His partner is around in New York. It was Kunstler and Kuby. So Bill Kunstler was the one who defended the Chicago 7 since you guys are from Chicago, you should know this. During the 1968 convention, when there were riots and the court case that came out of that one, Kunstler was one of the attorneys representing the main defendants in that case. And so I had interned with them while they were representing Sheikh Umar Abdurrahman, who was the blind cleric who had come to the United States and was preaching. And in 1993, there was the first World Trade Center bombing. And then in 1994, they arrested Sheikh Umar Abdurrahman and a dozen other folks, claiming that there was a conspiracy to bomb the Holland Tunnel in New York, and all these other cases, all these other charges. And Sheikh Umar Abdurrahman, who is totally blind, was charged with actually carrying explosives, or using explosives, which they dropped by themselves. The government did, realizing that that was a big joke to make that claim. So I had that kind of history before, and so I think I was, when 9/11 came around, I think that I was prepared for dealing with the fallout, and I was, I was going to stand my ground for the community on those issues, because some of the people, or a lot of them, that I ended up representing, and I didn't represent them directly in the sense that I was the trial attorney or the official representative, because some of them I knew and I would do specific things for them. So I've really had an input on so many cases, and I've represented them as an attorney, but as one of other attorneys who were representing them in cases. And some of these people I knew personally before they were charged. People like Ismail Royer, of course, I knew him before he was charged. He was a friend. We lived in the same area, and he was working for CARE while I was living here in Virginia. So I knew him from the community. We actually went on Hajj together before 9/11. And Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who was charged also in the mid-2000s. Sami al-Aryan, Dr. Sami al-Aryan, who the professor at one of the Florida universities, who had gone on Fox News, and because of that, it became really political. And Jeb Bush in Florida was after him. They didn't have anything, and so they concocted this whole terrorism case against him, and he fought it vehemently. He had a great attorney, Bill Moffitt, who passed away a few years ago, and he was one of the few cases where the government was actually defeated. And there were other cases, smaller cases, but going up against the government was never easy. And people would pay, so much money to bring top-notch attorneys. And at the end of the day, they would do the same thing that any other attorney would do, meaning that if it was a plea agreement, it would still be that 20 years. And this is not, to detract from any of those experts, but the point is that going against the government in the atmosphere of 9/11 was just so difficult. And yeah, the community was scared, and me personally and others who were like-minded, and organizations that were willing to go out there and educate the community in terms of their rights, and when they're visited by the FBI and so forth, just became part of what we did. And just did that throughout this period. And things have changed. Actually, the government has realized, to a certain extent, at least portions, at least people within the government, because the government is made up of people, of course, that we spent all this money in the wrong way. It didn't make America safer. The threat wasn't really coming from the Muslim community, but it was the hype. It was it was exploited by racists and people who were Islamophobes and so forth. And so things have also changed over the years. But that's how I got involved. Initially was just as a law student working on the case of Sheikh Umar Abdurrahman and the other co-conspirators as an intern in law school.
But you're being quite humble, though, because there were a lot more challenges in defending these people, including damage to your financial career, people, maybe firms not wanting to be associated with someone like you, maybe, or even the fact that it was something completely new to you, in terms of your experience related to defending against terrorism charges is an entirely new area of expertise that's being created by people like you. So there's not a whole lot of precedents you're working with. And so talk a little bit about that and just the financial damage that happened to you personally, and some of the other challenges that came along with this.
Well, I mean, I don't want to take any. I mean, there's really no credit to take for that, in the sense that, don't put me in a position where I have to, to say that I'm not humble. The issue with money is very simple for me, is that sustenance comes from God. There's no, that's not something that's in anyone's hand. And there's a hadith for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is that the meaning of which is that if you have shelter and you have food for that day and you have security, then you have the world. You control the world. And honestly, that's how I feel. I mean, part of I think the strength of defending the causes that no one else defends is that you get to live a life of reality. It's not a made up life that is changed by money and wealth. And that's not to say that I haven't experienced that at all. I mean, we regardless, we live affluent lives that no one dreamt before. Previously, the kings of old 2,000 years ago don't live the lives that we currently live. And so, I mean, we're so blessed. Like it's not even an issue to think about that. But yeah, I mean, I have children, I have a family, supported them all of these years, but money wasn't the biggest concern that I had, because the sustenance was always there. But doing these cases was important, because if there weren't people to do the cases, the truth needs sponsors and people to fight for it. The truth is there, but if there wasn't, if there's not an Umar ibn al-Khattab and not an Abu Bakr, and in this case not a Sim and not a Murtada, then it's not gonna go very far. So yeah, that was that was the case, and a lot of it is propaganda. You may be referring to something that happened on, I think in the Washington Post there was an article, and that was I mean, there was an article about me in the Washington Post a few years ago, and the blind attorney and bankrupt himself and so forth. Unfortunately, the bankruptcy laws, that people like take advantage of them. That wasn't even an issue, because that wasn't an issue for me. As long as you're not doing anything haram, you take advantage of the laws. But they wanted to portray me in a specific way. And they actually called my mom, my kids. I gave them access because he said, I'm going to write the story anyway. And he was recommended by someone. But it turned out to be, a hit job.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, it's not totally accurate in the way that I was portrayed in.
Yeah, I mean, we could definitely
Post.
see that you wouldn't be a favorite character to them to write about anyways. I mean, it's a kind of a given that it would probably happen. But I think more so than financially, though, maybe, and I'm just curious here for my own curiosity, it's not, I can't imagine it would be easy going up against the federal government, meaning that I'm sure there are ways that they may try to pressure people maybe not to take cases or to try to intimidate people. I don't think the government takes very kind to attorneys or lawsuits or maybe resistance. So do you have any experience with that? Meaning like maybe some unofficial like pressure or threats or anything from the government?
No, nothing in terms of any direct threats or pressure per se. But certainly, travel was difficult for a long time, and I haven't traveled recently. And unfortunately, with these lists, you can be on and you can be off again. Once you bring it to their attention, they take you off, but then you travel again, and some imbecile puts you back on, and then you have to go through the process. So there was a time that I was doing overseas travels, and that's another thing. I represented people overseas who were considered terrorists by the government. They were on the SDGT, which is the special designated terrorist list. by the by the Treasury Department, and so I represented people who were trying to get their names off of it. So I made travels overseas, and I've been in the hot places. You know, you can imagine. I haven't been in Afghanistan, but I've been in Libya, Sudan, Iraq, and Yemen, and Palestine, and Palestine. So for people, so unfortunately for the government, that was scary, and so the being stopped after coming in from foreign travel was an issue, and directly after 9/11. Domestic flights were an issue. Later, they didn't become an issue, and they haven't been. Well, and there was on and off and so forth. So really, other than the traveling, there wasn't any direct pressure. But I do know that definitely I was hated by the government officials that I worked with, meaning the prosecutors, or not worked with, but worked against, let's say, and the FBI. The FBI just hated my guts from what I understand, because even in you may know what's called grand juries, the prosecutor would ask people questions, and after 9/11 they would ask questions about me. Who's your, why did you contact Mr. Nubani? And the community. So if someone is called by the FBI, they'd say, call Ashraf. He'll give you good advice, and I would try my best to help anyone who was being contacted by law enforcement. And we went around just telling people, hey, look, you can decide whether you want to talk to the FBI, but we educated people to say that they're not there for you. They're not your friends, and people like the President of the United States don't turn left or right without having representation. So what about poor Joe Schmo, who is not going to have any protection whatsoever? So even if, because how Muslims are, mashallah, I have nothing to hide, and they invite them into their home and so forth. Well, the FBI is going to take advantage because they have a job to do, and it's their interests are not your interests. And so we would tell people, you can make the decision whether you want to speak to the FBI or not, but do not speak to the FBI without having representation. And they used those specific words where I said, 3 times, do not speak to the FBI. And they used it in court, actually, and Steve Emerson used it in hearings in Congress, where he said that there's this attorney, Ashraf Nubani, going around telling Muslims not to speak to the FBI. And it was just basically to educate people on their rights. So,
but it's not illegal to say that. I mean, you can say don't speak to the FBI without representation, right? I mean, it's not like you're prohibiting,
right.
or
well, you can even say don't speak to the FBI, even regardless of representation, because it's your absolute right. Right, in criminal cases, a criminal defendant never has to testify against him or herself anyway. And therefore, no one can make you open your mouth and speak if you don't want to, and therefore but no, I was telling people that's you need to decide that for yourself. I didn't want to be in a position, and that's how I was tagged, labeled as the community lawyer looking out for the interests of the community, not the individual client, and so forth. And over the years, of course, I grew in experience as well, in the sense that I'm not going to put a person in a position who just doesn't have the wherewithal to not deal with law enforcement. And so I'm not going to coax them, I'm not going to put pressure on them the other way. No, they have to make the decision, and I'm there to protect their rights based on whatever decision they make. And my job is to educate them, and that's what I did with my clients and those people who did come to me seeking advice when they were confronted by the FBI and had to deal with FBI interviews and so forth.
Right. So I mean, I'm just trying to put myself back like 20 years ago, like in 9/11. I mean, I was maybe 21 at that time, maybe 21, maybe 20. I would imagine that. I mean, because the reason why I'm asking this question is because if you grew up like kind of we did prior to 9/11, nobody really was interested about your faith, about your loyalties to America, nothing. I mean, it was just kind of like, oh, this is a regular, brown kid, around, America. But after 9/11, a lot of those things came into question for a lot of people. I mean, people didn't really say it, but you can kind of feel that. Were people beginning to maybe question your patriotism or your loyalty, and they're saying, well, why are you defending these people? They're terrorists. They want to kill Americans. Like, why would you? I'm sure you probably had to wrap around and deal with that, like, and from that perspective. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question that you bring up, Mor. I mean, yeah, when I think about it, actually, the answer is more no than it is yes, and I'll tell you why. If I had been a Jewish lawyer doing that, then yes, I would have received that action. And one of my mentors is Stanley Cohen, who's another prominent attorney in New York, who he represented Musa Abu Marzouk, the president of the political bureau of Hamas. And he's represented Al-Amoudi. He's represented so many. And I actually helped him on a case with the son-in-law of Osama bin Laden, who was convicted several years ago. So he's had incredible high-profile cases, and he was featured in mainstream media as America's most hated lawyer. This was after 9/11. But for me, so check it out. So here's where I come from. There was one wonderful, beautiful thing about living in Chicago. As I grew up, I went to Schurz High School. We had white students, we had Hispanic students, we had some black students, and then we had Arabs, small minorities, also Korean, and so it was a mixture. And just growing up, I mean, I felt like any other American, like you said. There were people weren't looking at your faith under a microscope. You were just living like everyone else. And I actually believed that for so long that America is this place of freedom and freedom of speech, and you can do and say anything you want. And yeah, well, you were doing regular things that everyone was doing. That wasn't a big deal. But when you mess with the powers that be, then of course it becomes an issue. But because I was a Muslim and I was a Palestinian, I grew up in the U.S. I think it didn't matter if I was working at straight-laced working at a corporation. I would still be targeted at the time as a Palestinian or as an anti-Semite. So it's like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So it was just nothing that even came to my mind, and that's how I deal with my colleagues, and I deal with everyone. And I think that people who really care about the United States, and I mean non-Muslims and Americans, they actually respected that. I received a lot of respect from people who understood that. In fact, like even the Eastern District of Virginia, one of my colleagues, he's a Mormon, an attorney, very well connected, and we built a relationship. And he wanted to ask around for his own sort of for his own gratification, he wanted to find out what the Eastern District thought of me, the prosecutor's office. And what he came back is he said, look, Ashraf, they tell me that they don't like how you go against the government, but they respect the fact that you speak for your people, for the community, and you're a Palestinian who has a cause, and they don't have any issue with you, and they realize that this is part of your job. And I don't know the accuracy of I mean, I trust this person heard it in that way, but I don't know what the government harbors. But that's the point. I never really felt I really never really felt that this was an issue, because I do feel that I'm an American. I think it's easier for Palestinians to do that because we don't have a homeland. So we adopted the U.S. as our homeland. Yeah. So it better treat us well. Otherwise, it's not going to look good for America. Just like Russia going into Ukraine doesn't look good for America. Right. We have to stop the hypocrisy. And I think that, I just focused on what wasn't hypocritical, and it wasn't really an issue.
Right, but you did have an early experience early on, like being a high schooler in Chicago. Maybe talk about that. Meaning, like, I think maybe that might have been your first maybe instance where you realize that, hey, if I don't say or do the politically correct things, there are repercussions. If I don't go with the grain, and that was I think when you were wearing a pro-Palestinian T-shirt in high school, I think, and I think that was probably one of your defining moments, right? When you were younger, like, okay, this is what kind of know where I am or who I am, right?
Right. Yeah, that was so. Yeah, this incident is in my book, "Bridging the Gap: Islam's Challenge for America," and the book is basically it's a bunch of essays that make up the chapter, where I interweave my experiences with the common misperceptions about Islam regarding violence and women and polygamy and all of these things. And so and to keep the book interesting, I did bring up stories in my life. And yeah, so this story was in 1982, and I was probably around 15 or 16 at that time, and I was in high school at Schurz. And in September of 1982 was when the Israelis had pulled out of Lebanon, pulled out of Beirut, not Lebanon. They stayed in the south for many years after that, but they killed literally, over 12,000 civilians were killed, and the PLO was kicked out of Beirut. And when that happened, the Christian Phalange groups that were supported by the Israelis went in and massacred Palestinians in the refugee camps that the PLO had been there to protect, or were there at the time because of the refugees that had been kicked out of Palestine in 1948. Right? What is it?
It's a Sabra and Shatila, right?
Sabra, exactly, Sabra and Shatila. And that just changed my whole life. Watching that on the news, and just seeing my family and parents and the world, I remember, what's his name? The guy from Canada at ABC News, Peter Jennings, he passed away, but he said, this is graphic and so forth. And so I didn't even know anything about the PLO at the time. So I wore a shirt that says Free Palestine and PLO on the back. And in like these huge letters, they were like this big on the back. And so they were interpreted by my principal, good old, Irish guy, tall guy. He was a Catholic, and his name was Gallagher, and he brought me into the office and he said, "Ashraf, look, I understand, what this means to you, but I have to take care of the safety of the school and the security of the school, and people may understand this as gang signs and this, and we can't have you wearing the shirt." And it was brought to his attention by a Jewish teacher in the hallway. So I was walking with my friend and the theater teacher, his name was Mr. Burke. He goes, "I don't care what anyone says, I'm going to get that shirt off of his back." And I was scared. I'd never been in the principal's office before. I was, good little kid at the time. And so I wasn't expecting to, but anyway, so I went into the principal's office. He said, "You can't wear your shirt." I was told by one of my teachers that, "Look, if you tell anyone that I told you this, I'm going to deny it. There's something called the ACLU. Call them." So I just pestered my dad for days to get him to call them. He called. We went and visited them in downtown Chicago. They said, "Look, sign some papers. If there's any media, we're going to be answering questions and so forth. We're going to defend you. This is your freedom of expression." And so, and so just weeks passed, and then they said, "Hey, you can wear your shirt." And they sent me copies of letters between the Board of Education and the ACLU. And they didn't even want to, of course, litigate it. There was nothing to litigate. It was obviously freedom of speech. And I ended up wearing the shirt. And, for Sabra and Shatila, for Palestinians, if you want to play, politics, that was their 9/11.
Yeah.
But the Palestinians, because they're defenseless and their cause hasn't been taken up except by the Muslim ummah in droves, but a weak ummah, no one cared. But when America goes through its 9/11, the whole world changes. And so anyway, that experience in high school definitely put me on a trajectory of fighting for people's rights and fighting for what's right and so forth. So that was the impetus for
I
doing.
mean, I could imagine why, and I think people don't realize, but that was a pretty defining moment, especially where things began to, I would say, pop off in the Middle East, where things were. I mean, yes, after things had kind of settled down after the '60s and '70s and early, but then that was kind of like the whole resistance type of movement that were coming out, and at the same time you had the Afghan Soviet issues going on at that time as well too, and then and then there's
It's
Libya,
crazy, like what his influences were, and ours. Ours was the Bosnian conflict and the Intifada that happened, in the '90s, but and also Kashmir and so on. But did you had like a just like the precursor to
right. And that was the moment, because people don't realize, I mean, this is where it was a collaboration between the Phalangist and like the Israeli government. And this was something that Ariel Sharon was directly involved with, where he tried to push off later on in life. But he was directly responsible for massacres that took place under his watch. And this is something that Palestinians never forgot, right? I mean, it was something that it's ongoing till today. They don't remember, they don't forget this issue, because it was a blatant crossing of a red line, human rights violations all over the place. I mean, innocents were, and these were people who went there as refugees in the first place to find some safety, and then they ended up being killed in a camp. I mean, like in a place where it's supposed to be. And I think what was the reason why they began to blame them and say, well, they're encouraging militancy by the PLO or by expressing anti-Israeli sentiments, and they didn't like that, and so there was a collaboration at that point. I believe. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit more.
Right. It was so with the Palestinian resistance, the resistance always had to be near to Palestine. You obviously couldn't run a resistance movement halfway across the world, and so the PLO had tried to set up shop in the 60s in Jordan, and they were kicked out of Jordan in 1970 in what was called Black September,
yes,
by the king of Jordan, King Hussein at the time, and so they moved to Lebanon, and they were armed. The Palestinian refugees were all over surrounding Palestine. So some refugees went to Syria, some refugees went to Lebanon, some refugees went to Jordan, and so they were all around Palestine as refugees, and there were Palestinians in Lebanon as well. When the PLO went there, of course, other people came with them, and because of the sectarian divide in Lebanon, which of course is a result of the French and the British. Where you have to have a Christian president,
yes,
a Sunni prime minister, and a Shi'i leader of parliament, and so that was their way of setting up this sectarian government. And then you had the Druze, and so there was a civil war in Lebanon, and the Palestinians got dragged into it. And there were some mistakes were committed, but it was a very difficult situation. And the PLO had set up shop there, and they of course had military camps there, and they used those were bases where they were attacked Israel. But there was always this animosity by the Phalange, the Christian Phalange, and not all Christians, by the way. And this is a misnomer. I mean, the not just the fact that Christianity has thrived in the Middle East under Islam. Given what people say about Islam and, the Islamophobes, you would think that they would have wiped out the Christians a long time ago. But there are a lot of Arab Christians who actually take pride in Islamic history and culture as their own. So as an Arab Christian, they would say, Umar ibn Khattab was an Arab. Yes, he was a Muslim, but he was an Arab, and he was a great Arab for them. And so, but there were those who were in the American camp and in the Zionist camp, and they had a lot of animosity towards the Palestinians. And I mean, these massacres were brutal. I mean, they, pregnant women, their stomachs were cut open with knives, and people were just, put in groups and shot, and right. The minimum, and that's the problem. They were buried. The minimum amount were killed was, there were statistics of like 750, but they were closer to 3,000, and it was like the 9/11. They were, I mean, if you want to be fair, Robert Fisk, who also passed away, was one of the first journalists to come on the scene, and he's been, he wrote about the Middle East ever since, or even before, obviously before that. But yeah, it's just the animosity, and this is the problem. This is the we're unable as Muslims to really speak about the truth of how we've lived with other groups and how we live in the United States. So there's so much propaganda against Muslims, but the reality is, look, with all of our monsters, and we have monsters throughout our history, there's no doubt.
Yes.
And I don't want to play the the relativity game, but the truth is that when it comes to tolerance, when it comes to concern for other people, I mean, Islam stands out. There's absolutely no doubt about that. You know, the example of the early Muslims, of course, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and the rightly guided caliphs are an example. Andalus, in terms of bringing Jews and Christians together, was an example. But the idea that, you know, these people are people of the book, and they deserve they deserve dignity and rights, is something that's in direct contrast even with modern, with the modern world, and coming off of colonialism and American power in the world. People feel, disrespected. Yeah, you say the game of rights and freedom, but we see something different in reality. So I think that Muslims haven't been able to articulate it well, but that it is the point. So there are a lot of Christians who have no issues, and 15%, probably, maybe it's a little less, but up to 15% of Palestinians are Christians, yeah. And we get along just dandy.
I think that's a really interesting point, because there's a certain push by the evangelical right to paint this narrative that Christianity was eradicated from the Middle East, and that Middle Eastern Christians are under constant threat, and because of the forceful nature or the authoritarian nature of Islam. And just to go back and highlight, I mean, I think unfortunately Muslims have not been able to get their narrative out regarding even our own history. I mean, there were times where you might remember this too, written in history, but when in the Levant there were Christian factions, Arab Christian factions, fighting against each other, and you had Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi come and open his citadel and saved a minority Christian like the Maronites that were being attacked. And this is something that we find throughout. I mean, these are just not one incidences, right? I mean, we find them throughout Islamic history. We find cooperations during in Andalus, even between Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, and other times later on where there was a way to have a cooperation, or when there was it was meaningful. We were able to maintain the peace, and we did so for a long time. And this is why we have churches in Palestine, in Syria. I mean, one of the oldest towns, Ma'lula, is a Syrian, an old Orthodox town, entirely still speaking Aramean. I mean, they still speak that language. The Coptics of Egypt. You have even in Ethiopia, you have the churches remained. Islam could have definitely taken over and you have an authoritarian rule, but the reality is it didn't happen. And I don't mean to be so blunt, but if Muslim caliphs wanted to eradicate any trace of Christianity from the Middle East, they could have done so without blinking an eye. They could have destroyed architecture, writings, books, and nobody would have said anything about it for centuries.
Right. No, I mean, look, this is, and this is not to say, people, so you'll have the Islamophobe, you'll have the critic who will say, they're painting this dandy picture and so forth. And that's not the case. Again, it's not to say that we didn't have our, sure. Our bad guys in history and our monsters. But again, intrinsically Islam. So what you say is so true. Look at it this way. Number one, when the Arabs, even in the Arabian Peninsula as Bedouins, and the Arabs who lived in what is now Iraq and in Syria, had roamed the Middle East for thousands of years. So even before the Romans conquered the Middle East, especially the Levant, but Palestine, Syria, that area, the Arabs had been living there. So you have these, you even have Catholics now, these right-wing Catholics who say that the Crusades, they defend the Crusades today, saying that, the Arabs in the 7th century stole or occupied our lands. but they never tell people that, okay, but before, so Rome is the first one to occupy the area, and then Rome became Christian 300 years later with the conversion,
Yes.
or hundreds of years later with the conversion of Constantine in 13, in the beginning of in the beginning of the 4th century, right? So actually, the Arabs coming out of the peninsula were really, claiming what was their own, but this time it was, with as Muslims. And here's the thing about Islam, and this is why Islam is hated by so many, especially in the West. For people in the West and postmodernism and what was built on the Enlightenment and before that the Renaissance, they cut off their roots of who they are, where they come from, and Islam is still that religion, that way of life that holds on to that look, your essence comes from God created you. Adam is your first father, and prophets came calling for Tawheed, and so you have this trajectory of history that's constant. And I think that in some ways they resent that. But Islam, then, if you look at the Prophet's history, peace be upon him, he was born a yatim. His father had died, and and the Quran says that Islam is the story, and in Islam is so much, is different things for different people. Everyone can get something out of Islam because it's the truth, and so, but you personalize it because you have a personal relationship with God. But Islam, when you look at it, is like going from 0 to 100, literally. And you would think that people in the West would respect that, not just because we support the underdog, but I mean, what else do you want in terms of civilizational success? Tolerance, trying to keep the peace and so forth, that human beings, they try to do. We fail a lot, but we try to do that. So with the Prophet coming out of the Arabian Peninsula as a yatim, as one person who built this ummah, and that after his death, Umar ibn al-Khattab and Abu Bakr, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Uthman, and Ali, conquered the half-known world, or a third of the known world at the time. And like you said, more, they didn't destroy churches. No, it's just the opposite. They actually built, Islamic architecture was built in many cases on the architecture that they discovered there, and they didn't destroy the previous cultures. They just added they just gave it the Islamic character. And that's what makes Islam so so beautiful, and that's the reality. And the Islamophobes want to say the opposite, but it's just not true.
Yeah.
Brother Ashraf, when you wrote your book, the main, at least the impression I came away with the book, I didn't get a chance to read the entirety of the book, but the brunt of the book, it seemed like an homage, or at least almost like a love letter to the Western society about what Islam is and how it can help, or how it can affect their lives, and how it can improve the overall condition of American society. Was that what you were basically coming across with in the book, or was it much more broader than that?
I mean, I think that the message of the book definitely was that I wanted to get people to think, and to open up a larger discussion, and especially now after 9/11, after 20 years have passed over the events of 9/11, that people would look at Islam objectively as much as possible and compare it to our postmodern world. And so we live in America. I live in the U.S. and have the benefits of living in these times and in this place. And yet, when I look at Islam, what it has to offer, and how I can put it into practice, I'm like, I think people are missing this because of the division between church and state, because of capitalism, and because we cut off our roots of where we come from. And if we were just going to look empirically at science, we're only going to trust or take heed in what we can see and observe and put under a microscope or under experiment. I think does a disservice to our humanity, our intellect as human beings, because the first thing that you would realize as a human being after after you discover that you exist, like Descartes would say, then you know that you're limited. But we've had the benefit of revelation to come to us, and not to open up our minds for that possibility, I think, has just been hurting America. And I wanted to, I wanted to bring out, I wanted to show Islam the way that Muslims, mainstream Muslims, have believed and practiced Islam for 1,400 years, and just my 2 bits about living in the United States, so incorporating my sort of experiences. But I want this for people who aren't Muslim to really consider this. I mean, I think it's easy for Christians to do because they already believe in an omnipotent being, and people who don't, they've just been. It's only that they've been brought up not to believe in God without even thinking about it, because again, they're not using their intellect to look at the broader picture. And so, I wanted to challenge those. I hope that that's what the book did. So it's not a love. There was no reason to put in things that are even more controversial, because that would be left to like a platform like this, where you would ask, push me on issues, or non-Muslims would push me on issues that I left out or didn't discuss, and so forth, and then I would respond. But I wanted to at least give people that, look, this is what Islam says, this is how we live in the United States. Don't you think that we can come to a better understanding? And so the idea of bridging the gap, and again, just to start a larger conversation. So that's the gist behind the book as I see it. It's a culmination of many years of experience and my understanding of Islam, which I believe is mainstream, believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, believing in the Quran as Allah's divine or Allah's words to mankind, and Prophet Muhammad as the messenger who brought the Quran, and that his life is a role model for Muslims to follow. And this is what we should be doing. And God calls upon us to do good. I mean, again, no matter what anyone says, when you see the references in the Quran to taking care of the poor and the orphans and those who are in your care, while the Muslims were powerful, and that's integrity. That's integrity. We rule the world in America, but we throw our money, like we see people starving in Africa, and we want to make ourselves feel good, and so we give money to those people. But that's not the way that the Muslims, the early Muslims, saw it. It was like, you don't go to sleep if people are starving, and you need to do it. We live in different times, and I'm not holding people to that standard. I am holding them to that standard, but I mean, we realize that we're going to fall below the standard. But at least we should know what the standard is. And the West has always changed the goalpost. They've always moved the standard, and that's where Muslims have always been lacking, and why we're behind, is because we're following instead of leading, and that's what a lot of people are afraid of. And I just wanted to bring that discussion out there.
I wanted your thoughts on. I don't know if you know of this person named Majid Nawaz.
Yeah, with the Quintillion,
Quintillion Foundation. Yeah, he had a recent episode on a big podcast called the Joe Rogan Experience, and he's now out of the Quintillion Foundation, and he's trying to look for a new job or something. So his new shtick is basically trying to prevent authoritarianism from re-entering Western democracies, and it's kind of ironic because he was someone who implemented that, who was using Quintillion Foundation to use the government to put its foot on Muslim necks. So he recently came on the show, and he had like a history of this debates or engagements with many other Islamic phobic actors like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and stuff, who all propagated this idea that there was something inherently extremist within Muslims, within Islam specifically. And I wanted your thoughts on that. Where did you ever feel like, in your experiences or your engagements with the Muslim or with the non-Muslim world, that that you had to bring up this idea of that something being inherently extremist within Islam. How do you dispel that notion?
Yeah, so this is well, that's so there's the threat and the perceived threat. There definitely is a threat to the West and to modern liberalism and postmodernism. There is a threat to that way of life and that way of thinking, and that is Islam. It happens to be the truth, and so in that way, it is a threat. But the problem is that Muslims are no more violent or evil or anything like that than any other people, than any other religion. No, it's just the opposite. That we believe if you have Islam, that you're going to be a step above people. And when I say step above people, I have to qualify this. Remember, if you're born, if you're born black, or you're born Hispanic, or you don't change the skin color, and you don't change your national origin. But Islam is a nation built not on race. Excuse me, it's not built on race or anything intrinsic in you. It's built on your relationship with God. And it's very clear. We've made Jewish tribes and people to get to know each other, and the best of you in the sight of God are those who are most God-fearing. I mean, like, this is really powerful, and every historian, every intellectual person, even lay people know that the more you know someone, the less likely you're to hate or to fear that person. And Muslims, because they're such a diverse group of people, and they have the Quran as their base, I don't fear like white supremacists. I understand why they're white supremacists, and I disagree with them, but I'm not like afraid and so forth. And when white supremacists, I don't know, recently Daniel, and I don't want to mispronounce his name, but yeah, he had an interview. I don't know if any of you saw it with a white supremacist in the UK. And, Daniel was ready to tear this guy apart. And at the end, they were agreeing on so many things. The white supremacist is like, look, I believe in national state, yes, but I love Muslims. I want Muslims to have their Sharia, and I could live with, with Muslims. I'm just against immigration. And, people were calling him to Islam in the chat and all of this. But not losing sight of what I wanted to say is that the problem that the West has committed, which is really hurting all of the world, not just Muslims, but it's hurting them. People are dying in their home with no one knowing about it until the stench of the decaying body is perceived, and someone calls the authorities. And we have this idea of gender identity issues, and we have greed. Kids are just growing up not believing in God and so forth. Okay, but what is it doing to society? What's so great about it? Okay, we have freedom, but what's so great about it? They don't want to admit that they cut off their ties to the past, that they led this world down, led the world down this path, and it's destroying the world, and it's destroying them before it destroys anyone else. And here's Islam to say, hey, no, look, there's another way. So there's the threat and the perceived threat, and people, and like the person that you mentioned, I mean, they're just trying to make a buck off of this tragedy, basically, just to make to make money off of it. But the idea that Islam is somehow intrinsically violent, whereas other religions are not, it's just not true. I mean, look, it's just objectively, it's not true. But you have to deal with people's perceptions, and that's what the worldview is about. How do you perceive the world? And I think our job should be to bring to bring people to a realistic view of the world. And I feel the only way I can view the world realistically is by being a Muslim, because when you submit your will to God, you're not beholden to anyone else on earth. You're not beholden to status. You're not beholden to other people. You're not beholden to greed. You're beholden to God, and therefore you feel free on earth, because you're calling people from the worship of other things and deities and God and gods and status and so forth, to the worship of the Lord of all of creatures. And so, I feel like I see the world plainly as it is. And it doesn't mean that non-Muslims or a person who doesn't even believe in God doesn't have something good to offer. And if they're not fighting humanity, they're not killing people, they're not harming people, then there's no harm from these people. But when we do things that harm others, then it becomes the obligations of Muslims to stop that. And I think that people are seeing through that. We talked, I think earlier before, about 9/11. Everyone lied about Islam so much that it had the opposite effect. People are like, it was a blessing in disguise, because not they were lying about Islam to the hilt, that Muslims worship a moon god, and
So
Islam is intrinsically violent and so forth. Okay, and you open up the Quran, and there's several verses about physical warfare, jihad, in the context of defense, in the context of self-preservation. And then you open up the Bible, and there's over 250 times the word sword is mentioned. It's never mentioned in the Quran. But it's easy for a Western mind just to throw that away, because they've already disrespected Revelation, their books, and everything. So it's easy to accept Jesus Christ as your savior, on the one hand, but it's okay to kill and occupy and exploit Muslims in the world on the other hand. They don't see a contradiction. That's because that's what they've done to their religion. That's what they've done to their history, and they want to take the world with them. And Muslims are really Islam is the only thing that's standing in their place, is because we can't change Islam. We can't change the Quran, and we can't change the Sunnah of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that's what they resent. And the moment we turn to that and use that as our basis, that's when they really fear us. They don't fear us now as much, because we're not doing that. And once we do, things will change.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of our current issues always goes back to this conversation about traditionalism versus postmodernism, like these new ideas. And I think you're exactly right, where when we look at the society that we have, or that has developed in the Western world based on this hyper individualistic postmodern world, it's very hard to count how many victories you have. Meaning in terms of, where are you winning? What are the benefits? The family unit has been destroyed. Children are left with single parenthood. Drug use is on the rise. Depression is on the rise. Suicide is on the rise. STDs are on the rise. And just so many different things we look at and we say. And the funny thing is that it's not only Muslims who see this. It's clear to us because we're Muslims. We know what's right and what's wrong. But there are traditional Christians and Jews and other faiths who are from a traditional mindset that see this happening, but the problem is that they don't have the solution because of what you mentioned earlier, that they are okay with people and groups changing what it is they originally believed in. And once it changed into something unrecognizable. For example, Christian can be Christian by faith only now. There's no action required. So you can say, hey, I believe in Jesus, but I'm gay too, or I'm an abortionist too. I want to go ahead and kill babies, no problem. For my body, my choice. But Jesus loves me. I saw recently a porn star who was talking about how she left it to become, a Jesus follower or whatever, or a Christian, and then she became a preacher's wife, and she realized, being a preacher's wife is too difficult, so I'm going to go back to pornography, but I know Jesus loves me, so the Jesus that I know is okay with this, right? And I'm saying, when you don't have these boundaries anymore, and it's a free-for-all, you're only causing the demise of your own society, and I think that the saddest part about all of this is, and in my humble opinion, is that when I look at the Middle East and I see the Arab countries or Muslim countries, and they're trying to mimic what's happening here, and for us who are in the belly of the beast, we're telling you, listen, this is chaotic. You don't want to deal with these problems. The stuff that we have to deal with here, people who are parents are terrified of what their kid might come home with tomorrow as far as ideas. It is literally a battle of hearts and minds. I'm not worried about going out and being killed in the street or being bombed. I'm worried about a kid coming home and being a mulhid, an atheist, or being, or being confused about whether Allah is his creator or not. To me, that's more devastating than anything, because for us, as much as the stuff that we went through as Muslims at a young age, but that grounding that we had, that objective reality and truth that we had in Islam was something irreplaceable to us. Like, I mean, it was something that firmly planted us, and that's something that the opponent didn't like. They didn't like the fact that we were so grounded they couldn't change us. They couldn't change the Quran. They couldn't change the Hadith. They couldn't change, you know, the idea, our dress code, our interactions, our commitment to prayer. These things are unchangeable to us, and that's what. But now they want to adopt these ideas that influence people to change these, and that's what's really, really, really sad to me out of the whole thing.
Right. So materialism is so powerful. Let's face it. It's so powerful that it is a threat to our children and to everyone. And it's like I said before that we're not respecting our intelligence and our intellect when we don't open our minds to the possibility of revelation, especially here, you know, in the West, and we just confine it to what we can see. We see the devastation of it. But, you know, going back more when you said traditional, you know, traditionalism versus postmodernism, you know, I don't even view it that way in the sense that, because if you say traditionalist, you know, we do come across as being, you know, medieval, and that's of course how they want to portray us. But here's the way that I look at it, and this is one of the things that like caused me to be a practicing Muslim. I grew up in a Muslim household, but I didn't practice Islam until I went to college. And I looked at other religions before that, and I took world religions class and so forth. And I decided that I wanted to practice Islam. But one of the reasons that my faith has grown is because of the ability of this book to be relevant today as it was or may have been relevant 1400 years ago. And really this is powerful. So we have the benefit of tradition. So we have that trajectory. So if someone becomes a Muslim tomorrow, Clinton, you know, Bill Clinton accepts Islam, you know, here he inherits Umar ibn al-Khattab as his forefather in faith, so to speak, right? And so you have that tradition. But at the same time, look at people are coming to Islam just based on what the Quran says to them today. And the idea that we, you know, as Muslims, we never really, historically speaking, again, objectively speaking, we didn't have an issue with faith and reason, in the sense that faith is, yes, believing in God and coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is based on faith. There's no doubt about it, but it's based on our, you know, our intellect and ability to do that. It's based on certain types of knowledge that include revelation, that include the idea of trust. If you trust someone and they tell you something, that you can take that to the bank with certain people. And certainly the trustworthiness of the Prophet and the companions who came after him and what they've established is something that, you know, has been golden. We built something on that. And so people, you know, people find solace in the Quran. And, you know, a'udhu billah, I don't want to, you know, say it in this way, but if you were to take out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the Quran, anyone who looks at the Quran objectively would still say this book is a recipe from coming from 0 to 100, meaning coming from almost nothing to, you know, ruling the world. And here's the other thing, you know, people are going to take this out of context, but, you know, it's not an issue of that we want to rule the world, but what's the difference? So I should give up my understanding of Islam and what Islam says about al-yatim and justice and everything that I believe is good, and you want me to follow a Western model? You want me to follow a human being who says this is, you know, this is the way to go? How is that any better? So we have every right to advocate what we believe in, just like people advocate what they believe in. But they want to take us down. You know, they're going down morally and so forth, and they want to bring the rest of the world down with them. And you know, we shouldn't expect that. We shouldn't accept that. And so, yeah, it's. Look, I mean, these people, you know, I really feel sorry for what's happening to Americans, because we live amongst them. We're Americans.
Right. Yeah. Right.
We're not doing enough to change that situation. And people who just like hear people or hear about Islam, they change 100%. They just never, there was never anyone to tell them. And they just believe again in materialism and what they see. And they just haven't been confronted with other worldviews.
You wrote in your book extensively about the gender wars that are happening between men and women, and what would you say is the biggest problem facing this this gender war that we're seeing unfold in front of us right now?
Again, it's part of the it's part of the trajectory of Western history, from Greek philosophy to Christianity to the Roman Empire to the medieval to the Middle Ages to the Renaissance to the Reformation to the Industrial Revolution to the Scientific Revolution, and to modernism and then postmodernism. That trajectory, which is different than our history, has led to the rise of feminism and pitting the sexes against each other, and this is a huge problem. If your worldview is that it's the male patriarchy that has oppressed women throughout these thousands of years, and that's your focus, good luck with that, because it's not real, and it's not a reality in the sense that, forget 3,000-4,000 years ago when men were protecting their women and getting food and protecting them from the elements, and they worked together in order to achieve that. That's our history as human beings. Forget it. It's still it's still true now. You have it was never an issue of intellect. And I always like to say, I like math is not my strong issue, my strong subject. So I flunked out of math. I did what I needed to do in college and so forth. But I'm not a math person. There's so many people, both men and women, that are just incredibly intelligent and great when it comes to math. So it was never an issue of intellect. But you have these wonderful people, these women, Muslim and non-Muslim, who have to prove that they can go into law school and they can be doctors and they can do this and they can do that. And then, in their career, 30s, 40s, they're like, what? I wanted kids. This is not what I wanted.
Yeah.
And so they have to overcompensate for something that, pinning it only on the male patriarchy is wrong, as opposed to us getting together. I mean, Islam really has it right. Even we as Muslims don't practice it. And again, it's not to say that there hasn't been oppression of women, women by men and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's the way things are set up, and we have to challenge our whims or our nafs to do what is correct. Meaning, you could be born 6 foot tall with the best muscle composition in the world, and then I can be born with a deformity and I'm 4 foot tall. Okay. And so what am I supposed to do? Say that it's because of this person, it's his fault that I'm in this situation? Or do we as human beings, come together? And I think that race is a challenge. The color of the skin that you're born into becomes a challenge, or the childhood you had and that you have to fight your demons. Or, like with homosexuality, with these gender identity issues, like Islam just don't do the actual bad act. It's not saying that if you have feelings towards males, that's, if you're a male and you have feelings towards males, that's okay. But no, fight your nafs, and that's what the West doesn't want to do. It just followed its nafs in everything. And the same thing with gender issues between men and women. Look, let's face it. At the end of the day, if you're going to pit the sexes against each other, what are you doing? I mean, you want men to be to physically beat up women? I mean, that's what would happen if you claim that they're exactly equal. They're not. They're not exactly intellectually in the sight of God, in terms of their capabilities. And you will have, outliers on both sides. Margaret Thatcher, mashallah, the Iron Lady, like, yeah, she's a leader. She would be better leader than any one of us. But is she the rule or the exception to the rule?
Yeah.
And so Islam doesn't even say anything about that. Sure, if there's a woman like the Iron Lady, I mean, there is a female who has the ability to lead. She would be a better leader than most of the leaders that we've had throughout history. There's no doubt about it. But does that mean that that is what should be the norm, or this idea of a quota? You know,
there is the problem. That
yeah,
right there,
having half men and half women. So if there are half men leading the world, there should be half. It doesn't. That's not how the world works.
I was just saying this real quick too. I think the part of the problem though is that, like, if I'm gonna just going back to the specific issue of like feminism and gender wars, right? When I look at it as, and it's funny when I see Muslim women taking on the feminist mantle, because I see feminism as a response to an issue that non-Muslim, specifically Christian women, had growing up in the past. Meaning that in Islam, women had rights already. Meaning that you had the right to inherit, you had the right for your own money, you had the right to get educated. All these things were there for you. But traditionally, Christian women didn't have rights. So they didn't have a process and how they would demand their rights, whereas Muslim women had a process already. And that would address the issue of oppressive men, right? What is reminding them of what the Quran says, what the hadith are, what the rulings are. But Christian women didn't have a regress for that. They could not say, okay, look, the Bible says this, or this is what should be done. So they had to create movements outside of their faith, outside of their grounding, to get their rights. And it's sad that Muslim women have taken this mantle that works for women who don't have Islam, but they already have something better, which is Islam. And then and what I fear the most is that, and feminism is just an example of other movements that will come. It's just not one movement, but the problem is that you're going to force the other side to also behave in an extreme way, and all you're doing is putting each other against each other. Like, if you're, like, for example, I have no doubt in my mind that there are bad men out there who are behaving like bad husbands and bad fathers or bad brothers, and maybe even taking advantage of women. And there are even groups like, for example, MGTOW, which is, men going their own way. And these things are completely un-Islamic, right? We're not red pill or blue pill, but these are all responses to extreme movements, right? And so one extreme action is going to have an extreme reaction. And so if we don't ground ourselves back in what is Islamic, and it goes back to my original point, we're taking on the mantle of issues that are not really our issues. Like, meaning that if you're a Muslim woman, you know what you have as a right. If you're a Muslim man, you know what you have as a right. You know what you have to provide. Like, we don't complain on a wedding day, hey, why do I have to pay mahar? Or why do I have to, why is my money her money? Or why do I have to leave inheritance to her? I mean, we don't argue about these things. We simply take them on because we know there's equity in it. And I think, just to wrap up here, is the biggest problem is that the non-Muslim world, since it doesn't have the equality in their mind they're looking for, they have to create these movements. But Islam is special in a way because it addresses equity and not really equality. It knows that equity is more important than equality. Because I could never expect a woman to fight the same battle that I do. Like, if we're going hand-to-hand combat, it's unfair. Anybody would think, what, are you crazy? You want to fight a woman? And that's just showing that it's not equitable for that to happen. It's equal if a man and a woman fought, we're two human beings, but it's not equitable. And that's what they don't realize.
No, exactly. That's an excellent point, and I mean that just happens to be true, and we don't. It's unfortunate that Muslims are falling into that, and they don't realize it. This is a big problem. Yeah.
Is there anything we left out that you really want to talk about, or? I know you said there was a poem in your book that was attributed to the Mamluks. I wasn't able to find it, but I searched the book for. Was it during the Salahuddin section where you were?
It was at the end. No, it was at the end of the chapter on Palestine. Palestine we can all applaud. It was at the end. It was a poem on Jerusalem and on Palestine, and I had just mentioned the Mamluks. Okay. In that, in that history, but I don't have it in front of me, or I would have.
I think I remember reading that part. There was a poem that was glorifying Jerusalem and then and its loss, or maybe it's
the history, just the whole
history of
Jerusalem from day one until until the situation now and the Palestinian cause. Yeah, that was just a poem that I had put in the book. And I just mentioned the Mamluks, that after Salah ad-Din, that the Mamluks came into power in Jerusalem, and then they lost power to the Ottoman Turks,
Right.
and the Ottoman Turks lost power to the
British.
The British, and then you put the quote for the British General Allenby, who said, "Today the Crusades have ended." So after he enters Jerusalem,
Yeah, but you know what this
they
reminds
haven't
me
ended.
of? It reminds me of that, the Arabic proverb, al hal la tadun, like, today nothing ever lasts. Tomorrow it could be France, it could be America, but at the end of the day we know, and this is going back to the grounding, that at the end of the day Al-Quds and these areas will be under Islam. I mean, that's just it's a reality for us. But today, the situation today, it changes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I have no doubt about that. We may be praying in Al-Quds together, in our lifetime. That's not difficult for Allah.
Yeah, nothing is difficult to imagine when you understand the greatness of Allah, His Majesty. Nothing. I mean, you just look, and this is before we wrap up here. This is why it's so important for Muslims to be grounded and know their history and their identity. As you mentioned, a Muslim who becomes a Muslim today, he inherits the legacy of the Prophet and the Sahaba that came after. When you see traditionally Muslims going out and in conquest or in preaching Islam or facing their enemies, they were always, almost always the minority. They never were a majority. They had the smaller numbers. They had the more insignificant technology. In many cases, we see it throughout time and time again in history. And what that shows us is that when Allah wills something and it's the right time, nothing can stop it.
Yeah, just look at the people in Ukraine. I remember watching a scene about a week or so ago, a little over a week ago, where there people in the capital, Kyiv, they were buying things in malls. Everyone was out on the street. No one had a care about 100,000 soldiers being at their border. No one was even caring. Like, it's not a problem. And now their country is just at the turn of a dime. It's being overrun by Russians now. Yeah. So the situations and border boundaries, power structures, they all turn within minutes, and at least when you compare it to the overall framework of time, just a situation where people can turn just like that with the snap of a finger. So don't ever, like, I hate this idea that Muslims just say, they kind of chuckle at you when you say that, we'll be able to pray in Al-Aqsa again without interference. They chuckle at you, or when you talk about Islamic governance or anything like that. There's people, and they're going to be laughing all the way until their deathbed. They're going to laugh at anyone and anything because they don't do anything themselves. Yeah. They're not actors for change. All they are is conformists. They just conform to what everyone else is doing in the world and society, and just criticizing from their sofa. So I encourage our listeners and all Muslims to not to listen to them and focus on your own ibadah, your own worship, your own dawah, whatever benefit you can bring to your family and your neighbors and society at large. Do that. Yeah.
So Ashraf, how do people get your book? Is it available on Amazon or what's the best way to get your book?
Yes, the book is available on Amazon, and it's available also at Barnes and Noble's, at least the internet version. And since it just came out a couple of months ago, I'm working on trying to marketing it myself. I own the copyright to it. So yeah, it's currently on Kindle and Amazon.
Sure, we'll put a link to it in our description, inshallah, so people can definitely pick it up.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We'll see you all next time. To our listeners, help us out on patreon.com/the Be sure to click on like on the video and comment in the comment section below with your thoughts related to what the episode was about. If you have any commentary related to your own experiences in life in the West and how it relates to your own Islam, be sure to comment in the comment section below. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you all next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Just mute it.